kind of find a seat. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's such a pleasure to have you all here. And I'd like to welcome you to the Island Lecture Series. This is a program that's been going on since the late 1980s, on and off, and it's part of the Institute of Island Studies. And tonight we're celebrating the launch of Finding Home in the Harbour by Barbara Palmer Rousseau. So I'm very excited about that. I want to thank you all for coming out, and I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, who have been here for over 12,000 years, and who signed the treaties of peace and friendship in 1760 to 1761. And as we are all living here on Epquit, or Prince Edward Island, I want to take a moment to consider how we can uphold our obligations as treaty people. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bren Simmers. I'm the managing editor of Island Studies Press, and we publish books on the island's economy and environment and culture, both on this island and also connecting with other islands around the world. And we're part of the Institute of Island Studies, which is located just down that hallway. And if you need to use the washrooms are also just down that hallway on the left-hand side. And there's lots of fascinating articles that you could, go down rabbit holes with along the hallway, all related to islands. And if you're interested in learning more about island studies, you can check out our website, islandstudies.com. We're also on social media. And in case you're wondering what this very exciting clipboard is about, it's we have a newsletter that we put out every month, and I'm going to pass this around. I know some of you are on this newsletter list. I recognize some of you from the lecture series. But please feel free to put your name down, and we'll send you an email or newsletter once a month. We will not sell your email to anyone, we promise. So as I mentioned, we're going to be launching this beautiful book, which if you haven't seen it yet, it's over there for sale by the Bookmark. Thank you so much, Bookmark and Dan, for being here tonight. And I really enjoyed working on this book. It's a beautiful collection of illustrated essays about St. Peter's Harbour. No apostrophe on St. Peter's, I learned. And Barbara, just a little bit about Barbara. I know she'll go more into detail, but she moved to Prince Edward Island, or Epquit, in 2020 to return to school after a 30-year career in software development in Ottawa. And she is one of our very own Master of Arts in Island Studies students, or MAIS students, as we like to say. And she's studying the environmental history of the North Shore dunes. So please welcome Barbara.
When Bren suggested I put together something for a book launch, I'm going, well, how am I going to give a lecture about a book of illustrated essays? So really what this presentation is going to be about is kind of the stories behind the stories. Originally I had thought at one point, oh, I'd like to write a book that encompasses my photography. And I just had too many photographs. And you'll see how kind of my art developed along with it. So, and the context of how this came about. And I'd really like to thank Bren, I do in the acknowledgements, because she's been an absolute great mentor as I've gone through the whole process. So this couldn't have happened without her. So I don't know if some of you have seen these memes, how it started, how it's going. So I kind of said how it started. The book, most of this material is in the book, but it's in different places. So this is going to be more of a chronology. So my first experience with the island was 2002, when my kids were really small. And in one of the chapters, I think, when I'm talking about To the Beach, I talk about my first experiences with the beach, trying to make sure that my youngest didn't eat the sand and not being particularly successful. So there he is at the top with a mouthful of sand. I tell you, those diapers were interesting. And on that trip, we went to see Greenwich with an obligatory stop off at Crowbush Cove for my husband Peter, so he could get a hat, I think. And so that's Redhead Harbour in 2002. across from Greenwich. It looks a little different now with the big Muscle King shed. I also talk about, when I talk about sea, I talk about how I took up sailing, tried to take up sailing at one point and discovered that I preferred to be in the boathouse deck rather than on the boat deck. So this was on the left was my sailing period. We took a tour on a sailboat at Charlottetown Harbour. So you can see the spires of St. Dunstan's just behind it, and that's 20 years ago. And I think that was probably the last time I was on a sailboat. And I just put that other picture in because this summer we went out for the first time to the PEI National Park since the hurricanes. And this is Dalvey 20 years ago. It looks a lot different today. For one thing, there's trees growing up, but secondly, wherever that was like right off the parking lot then. That's viewing platform, it's gone. So some of the changes that we've seen over 20 years. Our next trip, fast forward 2012, when we finally got back to Prince Edward Island, and this time we stayed at St. Peter's Harbour. I didn't really know that it was that then. It's just that when we had seen it from Greenwich, I said, oh, that looks like a nice place to stay, and there were several cottages there. So this was our first experience with the harbour 10 years ago, for a dozen years ago. And so the lighthouse is still looking kind of sad at that point. That was before the Lighthouse Society got started. And the cottage we stayed at was at the back of one of the sections. I'll show you a bit more later. And I just remember the scent of roses because, of course, we were there in July. But I've also since realized from this picture at the top right that that house is the old farmhouse where the church once stood and where it's Karen's farm now. But it's kind of the high point and significant historically of the harbour. That's my experience with paddling on the Murrell River. And I just sent this to you, Scott, the other day. We were talking about Creek Road and how at one point, according to the maps, we were supposed to be able to go down that road and get to Redhead Harbour, but kind of ended in a swamp and we gave up on that. Whoops. Okay, so a little more forward, this is after my father had passed away the next summer. The eldest was already in university, and the three of us went and rented the cottage at St. Peter's Harbour again. And I put that picture up on the top left because I went, I could get used to this. This was kind of the turning point in terms of getting property on Prince Edward Island. And at first I said, are you thinking about selling this cottage? No. But then I went back and checked out a few other cottages at the end of September, and also there was this land for sale, and that's what I ended up with. And the top picture is the beach at St. Peter's Harbour in September, when I talk about, you know, I could toast myself on one side and be chilled by the ocean breezes on the other. I remember it from that time. You know, in the end of September, you've got the cool northern winds and then the sun heating up the sand. So going to the harbour, I wanted to know a little bit more about it. I didn't understand why it was called St. Peter's Harbour. There was no harbour there to speak of. So I got in touch with the Nature Conservancy of Canada representative, and I was asking her all these questions. She said, I'll hand draw you a map. So this was my first kind of understanding of St. Peter's Harbour, and I talk about how it's basically between St. Peter's Lake, St. Peter's Bay, and in her annotations, sometimes she puts an apostrophe and sometimes not. And then the road, and there's a common theme here. And why is it all named St. Peter's? Well, that's part of the history of it. So next year, I had bought this land, and we put down stakes, literally. So there's, you know, we went in 2017, and we're putting down stakes on the property. And 2017, we got this gorgeous new painted lighthouse. Didn't have a weather vane on it yet, and I've since learned that until you have the weather vane on it, it's not watertight. So you can't, the Lighthouse Society couldn't put a light in until later on when we got a weather vane, and then Fiona blew it away. So then we had to wait a little while longer until we got a new weather vane. Also, I talk about, you know, it's all very well to come here in the summer, as any of you who've lived on PEI for a while know. But my contractor warned me that, you know, you really want a proper driveway. And this was the summer, but it was July and it was just poured. And that was why we needed a proper driveway. We needed some gravel down. So that was my first experiences with what the rain can be like. The bottom is when it was just a nice one of these wide angle views that I liked of the breakwater that I talk a lot more about in the book and in my studies, because it really illustrates how the sands have shifted. And the left one, I talk about the trees, that there are these 3 trees on the side of the property, and the first one came down in Dorian, the second one came down in Fiona, and we've got one left standing. But when we had 2 trees, it was the perfect hammock distance between. We have to figure out a way to put the hammock back up. Now I also talk about how PEI inspired me in terms of art. Not long after I bought the land, I finally took a course in acrylic painting. So these were some of my first acrylics. After that, like I'd done art in high school, but really didn't pick up any art until 2017 after we bought the place, and these landscapes inspired me. And the course inspired me too because the teacher had everything, she taught us basically how to mix colors. So I did everything, you know, the primary colors in white. Except that I soon learned when my blue ran out that ultramarine, if anybody knows art colors, ultramarine blue and phthalo blue are not the same. So this bottom right, it was like, okay, well how do I mix the paints with this new kind of intense blue? So there were still some lessons to be learned there. But this is on our cottage wall, so when the sun comes in on the with the half-moon window, it's really cool. So fast forward now a little bit more to 2019. We have the cottage built. I've decided that I'm going to go back to school, and we move here. I come here in the fall of 2019, beginning of September, to start school. I'll do 1 semester here. I'll live at the cottage, come into Charlottetown for my courses. Peter's back in Ottawa, and 2 days after we get here, we're in a hurricane. Out on the North Shore with the wind whipping around. And there's Peter leaning into the wind. So it wasn't that bad at first. It got a little more intense at night, especially when the power went out. The graphic is one that I kept for a long time that I found really interesting. And one of the things it shows is different than Fiona in terms of the track of the hurricane. So the winds in that one moved east to west, and there wasn't the storm surge. So you can see from the bottom picture, this was taken not long after Dorian, in the first week, that there's a little bit of erosion, but even the further dunes, not much. There's still a nice gradient. There's still a ridge of dunes all the way down to the lighthouse. And we get erosion like that from some winter storms. So Dorian, you know, it was an education. I write about that in the fall chapter on drifting dunes. And I found that September, there was a lot of wind, just with weather bombs. So every time the wind blew, it was like, it started freaking me out again. So there was a lot more of a psychological impact. And I spent a lot of that semester at the university. Actually, this is from the Dawson Lounge upstairs, waiting for the winds to die down so I could drive home. So my first semester at university, I took 4 courses. They were all introductory courses, more or less. Actually, the climate change was online. I took it in the winter. But these were 2 of my most significant courses. And the island environmental histories, I didn't know it at the time, but I would circle back to that several times. So Josh is fairly familiar with this book. And I think you designed that course, Josh? Yeah. So I already had the book, because it was a good introduction for me, but taking the course, I realized how much I hadn't read it. So these were some of the influential courses. Other ones, I was taking a Bachelor of Integrated Studies, so that's for mature students. And you have to have a concentration, so it was in environmental studies. And I also took the courses on environmental services or environmental valuation that turned out to be influential because I did a project at the end where how much would it cost to actually put a physical infrastructure in to replace the dunes at Greenwich. And it's a pretty entertaining number and actually really minuscule if you factor in everything else. But also one of the courses that I think you're taking now as part of your internship is on systems and resilience thinking, and that was also very influential, and I wanted to think about, what sort of ecosystem services do I want to look at. So that was the fall semester. So went back, we sold our house, we closed on it. The next day there was a pandemic declared. So we had 3 months to pack up and figure out how to get onto the island, because you had to fill out all sorts of forms and stuff, and we didn't have a house anymore. But it was a really nice time to be isolating in June at a cottage where you had a lot of space. So you can see Peter going for a run. The property next door isn't ours, but it's vacant. It was then, and it is still now. And we had all this bird life and a lot of songs. And the pond was full. I get depressed at the end of the year when it's dried out like this year, but the pond is full of water at that point. It's Barashell Pond, so it's fed by the water table. And so I write about that somewhat in Springtime Songs. The peeper chorus is basically over by then, but there's still a lot of birds, and the warblers are very obliging for photography. The yellow warblers and the common yellowthroats. I could have lots more slides of those. And then once we got out of our isolation and we could go for walks on the beach, June is about the time for the piping plovers nesting. But what happens to me most of the time is I take these pictures with a long lens and then I crop them down. And it's only when I crop this particular one down that I realized the plover was actually sitting on the eggs. The Nature Conservancy and Parks Canada had cordoned off an area where they knew they nested, and this piping plover was sitting smack in the middle of it. And so it was definitely a long lens. And then I also write about the marsh hawk. We see the marsh hawk, the northern harrier, swooping down the pond a lot, and it's quite the sight. So that's one of the better pictures I got that year of her, because it's the females that have the orange coloring. The males are white and very distinctive. So the other interesting thing about the March of 2020 and the pandemic was that was my introduction to island studies. I was taking the Introduction to Island Studies course online, and the week the pandemic was declared, the week we got back from our trip to the US, because while the house was being sold, we were working on islands and pandemics, island epidemiology, is that how you say it? So that was slightly ironic. I'm sure there's a lot more now that has come out as a result, and I know that Dr. Randall was involved with quite a bit of it, but it was just an ultimate irony that that was my introduction to island studies. So, foxes. that was the starting chapter and one of the first things I started drawing, foxes and birds. In the book, I say the first ones you meet, I mean, we'd seen foxes in our previous years, but the first ones I write about here is, I call them short tail. So there's short tail squirming around in the grass, probably because he has mange at that point. And then his partner, long fur, on the left there when she's really, she's not really starving or anything, is at that point in the summer where for one thing she probably has mange as well, but she's feeding the kids or making sure they have food before she gets food. But then she's, by the end of the summer, she's quite healthy again. And there were kits around. They were, at that point, under the neighbours, Julie's brother, deck, and I think there were 6 of them. We'd hear them and we'd see them running around, kind of shadows of them, because there was hardly anybody at the harbour that year. This was the pandemic. Most people couldn't get to their cottages. This might be the same one, though, because they didn't come to our property much. So I think it might be the same kit, and then that's on the road later, and that was really when I used the image of all legs and ears, like this teenage fox. So then 21, in the spring, we saw short tail again, and now he's got all his fur back in, he's really fluffy, and we never saw him again. So I don't know what happened. But long fur was around that summer. She wasn't quite as scrawny because she didn't have to feed any kits, I guess. And then in November, we met this other character, and he's still around. I call him Silver. And there he's a mix. But in the summer, you don't see the red as much, but you see it in the various offspring. A slight segue, because I do have a chapter on trees, basically, I call it Going Spruce, was the McPhail Woods Ecoforestry course. That was for those of you who've done environmental studies or are in environmental studies. It really showed me what can be. You know, I was used to seeing the spruce on the island, and I was really surprised when I got to that. And it turns out that Gary Schneider, whose brainchild this is, had come from the same area, grown up on the Niagara Peninsula like I had. And I said, well, this looks like the woods I'm used to. And he said, well, this is actually the Acadian forest, or now we would call it the Wabanaki forest. But this was all done out of farmland 30 years ago. So that's, you know, we can't grow the same sort of things. One of the things I learned on that course is that, you know, specific types of trees and bushes for specific areas. So a lot of what they were growing there, more in the South Central, wasn't valid for our neck of the woods. But on the other hand, you know, if you knew more about the property and principles of diversity, of planting the right things, of replacing invasive species, because I always wonder, you dig up invasive species and they're going to come right back. You have to replace them with something else. So that was some of my education on ecoforestry and trees, and this was the map I drew, and it had almost nothing to do with what the team came up with in the end, but it was a good experience. And I also mentioned in the book that I didn't do very well at tree identification because I was too busy watching other things like the sapsucker on the trees there, and just the diversity of bird life that you could get there. So, and the other neat thing was, for me, was the first time I'd seen a salamander. And I didn't think that they were in our neck of the woods, but recently I've seen some fried ones on the roadways. So I know they're in our neck of the woods, I just haven't found them live yet. It's like the peepers, they hide very well. So if you have the appropriate knowledge, and I talk about that a bit more in my trees, about letting them have their own resilience. You know, we've tried to plant spruce trees, that hasn't worked very well. What we have to do is let them grow and support each other. Going back to my art, people say, you know, well, how did you learn? How did you take up art? And this was the pandemic. It was a lot of online classes. So just if any of my art friends have been here, I was going to say these were some of the online places that I went. I started experimenting with some of my own designs, but I ended up mostly giving those away because I didn't know how to sell them in context. So it's a gradual process to developing some of these skills. So 2022, kind of turning points for me. I got my first articles published, niche network in Canadian history and the environment. And the first one about the harbour was actually an evolution of something that I'd done throughout my undergrad. First in a history course, writing a history paper, I was learning about it. And then in a ACLC, applied culture, leadership, applied communication, leadership and culture. You guys tell me. Brendan was my professor, to do a project that could turn into a blog post. And that was the eventual blog post about the disappearing harbour. And I also write that I've found history to be malleable, or you learn new things all the time. So when I wrote this, now that I'm doing more research on my master's thesis, I'm finding that some of this was wrong because I didn't have enough information. And there'll be a little bit on that later. And then when Fiona hit, I don't actually have a lot in this presentation on Fiona because I think I've exhausted it a bit with the articles I've written before. And this was with Niche. I wrote an article afterwards about how much the landscape had changed with Fiona. And the relationship we'd actually had, it was a 99-year storm because if you look back at the history, there was a similar storm in 1923, but did not have the same sort of things reported because in 1923 they didn't care much about the dunes. They just cared about whether the lighthouses had come down, and then there wasn't the issue with power as much because there weren't as many power poles. So there were similarities and lessons learned and differences. And also, you know, how can we help the dunes be more resilient? Ironically, it was the week, Fiona hit the week I was presenting in my Island Studies course my research question. And my research question was about the resilience of the dunes. And then before the next lecture, we had a hurricane. And then we were without power and didn't have a lecture for at least a week. And some of you were without power for much longer. And then, oh, sorry, I should go back to that. And there's me getting my BIS, Bachelor of Integrated Studies degree. It's still in pandemic, so we all had the masks and bumping elbows with Dr. Junchik. Is that how you say his name? And then I went into pretty much directly into the MAIS program. One of the other fun things for me in terms of publication was I had written these two articles, and it was the first time I'd published anything academic. And at the end of the year they said, oh, your articles were the first and fifth most read articles for Niche this year. What did you do? And I go, I don't know. It turned out that a lot of people wanted to read about Hurricane Fiona and the impact on the dunes. I don't know. So now, 2022, this is Meet the Family for the foxes. So this particular year, they were denning on the property next door. So we saw them come out end of May, early June. And there were 4 of them. It was hard to get a picture of all 4, but I think the top right. So I called them Quiet One because you can kind of see in the top right, and I think the middle bottom picture, that she always had one of the paws up. I think she was a bit lame, but it didn't seem to stop her much. And then Red, I pretty much concluded the males apparently have wider cheekbones. Rosemary, where'd you go? Yes. So you would, that's, I think that's what you wrote in mammals. So I think red and one of the darker ones were male, and then the quiet one and one of the darker ones were female. And the really dark one I called Wolverine. I don't know, bottom left. You can see them competing over a hot dog there. Which is, I write about in the book, and it was recently on CBC, that, you know, I appreciate when some of the neighbors want to make sure the foxes are healthy and stuff, but now we have a rather large fox population, and you know, we don't have the carrying capacity for that many foxes, so they're going to suffer in different ways. But it was cute to watch them next door grow up, chase each other around. I talk about them playing King of the Castle up there on the left. I also write about the fox's love of shoes, which you can see in the middle picture. So I didn't believe it at first. I lost a shoe at the beach, and somebody said, oh, maybe a fox took it. And we've seen several shoes on our property since. So yes, the foxes do seem to like shoes, but they'll only take one, which doesn't help much. Might as well take the pair. So this led to, I was still taking art classes, but I was starting to do some of the sketches, more the ink sketches of the foxes, playing, and of the eagles, which I write about in the last chapter. Their inspiration, the awe you get when you see the eagles flying, and the hope that they bring for the future. But I'm still struggling a bit with landscapes and watercolors, so you won't see much from that period in terms of watercolors in there and landscapes. So 2023, I finally connected with the Lighthouse Society and worked on their heritage pages. And this kind of came out of that, you know, the blog I'd written before, and this some of the organization and lessons learned from that, and digging in a bit more on some of the materials that the Lighthouse Society already had, but then helped get things organized a bit. And that is up on the webpage now, and that was a great learning experience. And a lot of that is now also reflected in the chapter Safe Harbour, the history. Because it gave me more information about the site. 2023 was also kind of the turning point in terms of this book. I took the course, Laurie's course on islandless culture and identity, and one of the exercises was a walk on the edge assignment, and that a lot of that gets in the to the beach, although the walk on the edge was written in the middle of winter, and to the beaches on the summer. And then the final project, I said, well, I like this idea. Now I've got some paintings I could use. How about a book proposal? I'd like to publish something. So Laurie put me in touch with Bren, and I put a few chapters together, and Bren suggested that Island Studies Press might be interested in printing it, in publishing it. And and then the board said, could I finish the book? Could I write the rest of the chapters? And so I sort of had some idea of how I wanted to organize it, and sort of started writing it up. Well, I basically wrote it up over that summer, and it changed a lot, because as I started writing it, oh, okay, that doesn't fit there, or maybe, anyways, it was a lot of what one writer calls about bad first drafts. It was one of the things I learned about writing this sort of thing, is you just put the ideas down, and then you start organizing it and see what fits and what doesn't, and what you have to add to it. So learned a lot about writing in that. I tried to take courses before in writing, but didn't really have something to focus on that I wanted to write about. One of the other things that's fun since Nick's class is here was I was taking, I can't remember which class, the, not sustainability, the other one, political ecology. So I was writing this book in creative nonfiction, and I was doing assignments for a master's level course. They're both different types of writing, obviously. So I would be writing my assignment, and there'd be all this narrative in it, and I'm going, I don't need that for the assignment, for the paper. And then I'd be writing the book, and there'd be all this detail about my research. So hopefully we cut most of the detail out, but it was a bit of a challenge, bouncing back and forth. So that was my book proposal. That spring, I also submitted art for the UPI Arts Review, and I went to the launch in April or May, and I flipped it open, and I went, okay, there's that picture and that picture. Where's my fourth picture? Oh, it's on the cover. Cool. So the foxes, these pictures are also in the book. One other neat thing in terms of art was last year I connected with some local artists and went and did some plein air for the first time on the southwest part of the island. And it made a lot of nice connections in the arts community and felt more like an artist. I mean, before, okay, I'm dabbling. I don't really call myself an artist, but they said, if you're doing art, you're an artist. Okay, I'll take that. And I also tried doing a few other things like the toned paper and palette knife painting, but I won't show you those experiments at this point. So it was a busy year more in terms of, well, finishing my courses, but also starting to integrate art and research and writing. And so now I've got up to how's it going, how it's going this year. I've been really fortunate to meet with some international scholars who are researching environmental history of dunes, which is exactly the sort of thing I was looking at. I'm fortunate to go to Portugal in the spring and meet some of the scholars, and also Christoph Mauch of the Rachel Carson Center, and then some interesting activities have followed from there. Not so much related to the book right now because it was already pretty much finished, but relating to, again, making history public and relating art and research and creative writing. So the top right there was an interesting aspect that came out of this. Was one of the research scientists there is a lady in Mexico who researches coastal ecology. And she said, oh, we have this magazine, I want to put your art in it. So I submitted some of my my sketches from the summer to her, and she put them in the fall issue. So I can't speak Spanish. I wish I could, because this magazine looks really interesting. They have a really good way of disseminating the knowledge on the research that they're doing, the Ecological Institute of Mexico. But Art des de Canada, so that's mine. And just a few pages about the dunes and the ecology there. I was also working this summer and hopefully in the future on Josh's Ecology's Knowledge and Power in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And so it's following on from some research I've been doing on maps. You know, I'll show you a little bit more in a minute. And so does the GeoPI viewer that Josh and Bailey and the lab have put together. And I don't know why the screenshot came up like that, but I spent a fair bit of time down at public archives looking at historical maps, historical records of engineering records, because part of my thesis is how the dunes are not so much natural anymore because we've modified them. And, you know, what are we trying to preserve? When you've got dunes at the lighthouse, those dunes are only there because the lighthouse is there. 300 years ago, actually that was open water. That comes up later. So there's a lot of human intervention, and it's now, as Joanna Gaspar-DeFreitas from the Dunes Project says, that it's, they're hybrid. Hybrid human and nature. So here's the gist, my whole lecture in 2 slides. So this is some of what I've discovered with my map research, and some of what is sort of covered in the chapter Safe Harbour, but some of which I've discovered since I actually wrote that. So in GeoPEI, we have access to some of the old maps. So 1928-29, the Cummins map, 1935, the first aerial view. And in this, we could already see that there was, to show this, I could probably do this with my mouse, but I'm not sure. So over here is where the lighthouse is, that's all the pictures, and the old wharf. And then over here, there's a breakwater, or there's some sort of structure, and the sand's collecting around it. So originally when I did the disappearing harbour, I thought that this was an attempt to create a breakwater. It failed, and this is what happened. And then with my research, and looking at maps and some of the engineering drawings, I went, oh, wait a minute. No, that was connected. That was connected here, not long before. You know, why does the map look like that? And then you go back into the public works records and you see that actually, you know, these were intentional, and there was, you know, intact breakwaters as early in the early 1900s. There's a lot of other history with building the breakwaters. The original one and the lighthouse were erected in 1878. That's, you know, there's a story there that is hard to tell from just a few aerial photos or just a few maps. But how much the water can change rapidly, can change things rapidly. And in the book, I then said, okay, well, look, from all the news reports that I've read, it was closed off by 1940. Basically, they put in the wharf as actually an unemployment project in the early 30s. And by the 1940s, they couldn't even use it anymore. And they started using Redhead Harbour. So I thought I had the answer there. And then after we'd already sent the book to press, I discovered this drawing at the top in the archives. And this is 1940-41, and it shows that it wasn't quite closed off yet on the left. But I also find it interesting because it shows that they were still trying to do some work on the Greenwich side. It had washed over in probably 1923 in the storm. There were some sand hills, and they said, oh, we'll put a fence in here. And you probably can't read that there, but it also says something about Old French Harbour. And there's nowhere else we found any records that says that's where the French Harbour was. Everybody kind of figured it's on the other side. But if you look at the old maps and such, you know, it's the way things had moved, it wasn't necessarily there. So there's, you know, you answer some questions, you raise some more, and you make some general assumptions. But we can see from the aerial photos that by the 1950s it was a sand flat. By 2010, we've got more recent ones, there's dunes there. So the dunes are there, and the sand is there partly because we built breakwaters. You know, we were trying to make the bay more shallow, and instead we closed off the bay. So now the boats all go to Redhead Harbour, which is down here. And if you want a more recent example, go look at Tracadie. If you look at Tracadie, I didn't put it in here, but if you look at Tracadie on Google and you look just at the map, it shows a channel. If you put the satellite view over top, it shows it's closed off. That's in the last 20 years or so. And in between, you know, CBC even reported there was a new island. Speaking of, you know, islands around the island, as the current changed. So it's always moving. If you look at the old lighthouse records, most of these, St. Peter's Harbour is no exception. St. Peter's Harbour was there were two lights, because they were range lights, they were leading lights. You line them up to get into the harbor. But you see the old lighthouse records, and they always say the rear light is subject to change because the channels kept shifting. And basically, I think my speculation is that the rear lighthouse blew down in 1923 with the storm, and they didn't replace the lighthouse because they already had poles that they were shifting around at that point. So, and then, so that's the academic side of the research, and lining up with the art side. I have a couple projects that came out of Dunes that are blending more art and research. There's going to be a virtual exhibit with the Rachel Carson Center that I'm a contributor to, where we have, you know, an exhibit, in my case a painting, and a description of how that relates to our research. And I've also been selling art at some of the local sites. And this year I did the cover art for Arts Review as well, and I have actually one chapter from this book that went in that as well. And in the fall I'm going to be, in December to February, I'm going to have some of my art at the gallery, Coffee House and Bistro, which I understand usually has arrangements with Bookmark as well. So that's some of what's happening. And I'm open to questions. I'd like to thank, as I mentioned, Bren for organizing and championing and educating me on this. And some of the groups I've worked with, the UPI faculty and staff, the GeoReach team, my Maze classmates and colleagues, St. Peter's Harbour and Morel communities, my family and friends, the PEI art community, and there's some of the relevant links if anybody's interested. I don't know if I addressed what you expected. I welcome any questions on contents or process. Or
Yeah. So does anyone have any burning questions? Or Fox-related questions, Dune-related questions, map-related questions? It's a really broad overview of an area, and it really touches upon so many different disciplines and subjects, and so it was fascinating. I learned a ton. Any thoughts, observations, Callum, and then we'll go to you next.
Did you do any work on the Greenwich side in terms of how the dunes have changed or not changed?
yeah, I should clarify. Like this, my book is focused on St. Peter's Harbour, but my thesis goes wider, and that's why I was talking about Tracadie. So I was originally going to look at more sites all along the coast, and I kind of had to narrow it down a bit, but I'm still looking at from basically Cavendish through to Greenwich. So you've got 4 zones there, or bodies of water, and they all are affected in similar ways. So yeah, Greenwich is particularly interesting because of some of the things I'm finding about St. Peter's Bay, and there's also been a lot of scientific research done at Greenwich. Not so much on the history side, although there are some good references there. So yeah, and I found particularly that this last map, because it touches on Greenwich there on the right, because the scientists had assumed from the aerial photos that it was completely washed over, and I find that interesting because it still shows sandhills in 1940, so it wasn't that long after. So I don't have anything specific yet, but that will be part of my research.
That's a question in a second,
Margot?
What was the most astonishing thing you found in your research?
I'm still working on it.
2 days ago.
I'll have to think about that for a while. I mean, there's all sorts of cool things, and you keep uncovering new stuff, but...
That's never been seen before.
Well, yeah, that's one of the coolest that I've come across so far, but there's so many questions that raises and so much room for interpretation. So, you know, after a while, it doesn't astonish you so much as put another piece of the puzzle, or sometimes over sometimes confuse you, but sorry, don't have a straight answer for that. But one of the things I did like about doing this book was it let me be a bit more general. Because, and also with my research I'm trying to do that a bit, because one of the drawbacks for me, or one of the reasons I was like initially dubious about a master's program, was I didn't want to get that specific. So I really like this because it let me look at questions from multiple sides, from the artistic side and from a scientific side and from a historical side. So actually, personally, one of the most astonishing things for me is not so much from my research, but has been when I started working on the St. Peter's Harbour website, all of a sudden I was the historian for them. And I mean, I do not come from a history background, I'm still learning about that, so it was a bit astonishing for me to be considered the historian.
Nick in the back, and then we'll go to...
Thank you so much for a lovely presentation, Barbara. I'm just wondering if you can reflect on what is it about living on this island that kind of pulls out the artistic tendencies in people. I know when I was going to school in Waterloo, there wasn't an artistic bone in my body. Well, when I'm in Newfoundland on the Port Peninsula, like I want to be a photographer in Poland.
Yeah.
What is it about this place that pulls that out of you? Do you have any sense?
I write that a little bit. But I think that's, I mean, Lori's smiling there because that's one of the questions for, and I think she probably addresses it much better. For me personally, it was my muse, if you will. I mean, it was stuff that I wanted to capture in different settings, and I didn't have as much of that opportunity. I also felt more connected after I'd done the research and the writing and spent the time. And for me personally also, it was that I had more time to look at things and observe in more detail that I didn't have previously. But you know, I went to Waterloo too and didn't have an artistic bone then. So yeah, so and for me, the other thing that I also reflect on in the book is being surrounded by water. The smallness, that it's contained. It's a manageable concept in my head. It has boundaries from that point of view. But I think for me, it was inspiring. The landscapes were inspiring, but for me it was also because I had the time and I could slow down and observe better.
Laurie?
Thanks, Barbara. One of my questions is about the people that live along the shore, and I was just thinking about St. Peter's and wishing Frank Ledwell were still alive,
Yes.
and what he would tell you, or what he'd be able to tell you about how the dunes have changed in Greenwich or St. Peter's Harbour and that. Are you able to tap into some of those memories from the people who are living out there?
I haven't been as much. Some of my neighbors behind you know the people a bit better. I have tapped into Frank's writing. He wrote the introduction to Juanita's Gone to the Bay in 2000, and I asked Jane to update it for the current time, and he also, in that book you lent me, the Taste of Home, his book, he writes about the burial site, the Mi'kmaq burial site, which is kind of, hasn't been formally mentioned elsewhere. It's kind of more passed down orally about at the bend in the road. And also the website itself, there's a wealth of knowledge already encompassed in the St. Peter's Harbour Lighthouse Society website, where they had talked to locals and got photographs, and so I was able to tap into that. So it has kind of been once removed. I've been talking to the people, although I did talk to like Don McEwen, Scott's uncle, about some of the, the history and islandness for
And
your,
then
for
thinking
your
about
course.
Cavendish too, if you're going to start at that end, there's so many stories, and Phil Davison knows that. He's heard so many of those stories.
Yeah. For my research, I'm looking more at the environmental history than the than the individual stories, so
No,
more
but
the,
it's to capture that
yeah,
environmental history. that I'm talking
yeah,
about.
that's kind of beyond the scope of what I can do. So like, even to tap into the local knowledge, and just the small island aspect. When I was out at, doing volunteering at Artisans on Main at one point this summer, I was with another artist who makes like these amazing driftwood things, and her last name is Label, which is a common name. She's like from the Morel, her husband's from the Morel area. So she was talking a little bit about that, and I said, oh, do you know this family and such? And she said, well, I don't, but my husband would. And then a customer came in, and it turned out that she was labeled as well. So they started comparing notes and where they lived, and so you don't have to go very far sometimes to get the individual stories.
I'll take one more question, Dasha.
That's a good question. Just I want to say thank you very much before we return to our class with me. It's amazing to see how our peers, like how our students do like the same program, but it's such a great milestone that you do your academic work and you can find time for your artistic. It's really inspired me so much, and I'm proud that I know you, and it's really cool.
Thank
It's
you,
inspired me
Dasha.
so much.
I will say that I'm privileged because I can do this at this point in my life. I recognize, like, I went through school, I didn't have time to do anything much than learn how to be on my own, and I always said I'd go back to school, so now I finally did.
Just a few closing remarks. Thank you so much, Barbara. I know Barbara is happy to sign books for you. There's a signing table over there. And thank you to Dan from the Bookmark. We would not have thriving arts scene on this island without you, so thank you for all that you do for us. Just one last plug. The next lecture is November 19th with Dr. Michael Vanden Heuvel. He teaches here at UPI, and he's going to be talking about water sustainability on the island, particularly looking at groundwater. Very important topic. November 19th. Hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone. Get home safe.